Hey, it's Tim here. In today's video, we're talking about the attribute function inside of Tableau. In one of my previous videos where I was talking about new models in Tableau 2020.4, I used the attribute function to get me out of a tight spot inside of a calculation. And so a subscriber simply asked, hey, can you go into more detail about that function? So here we are. In today's video, what I'm going to do is tell you what the attribute function is, some use cases for it, and then lastly, some limitations to be aware of. Okay, let's get stuck in. Okay, to get this video started, it's really important you pay attention to this next step. I need you to connect to the American Superstore sales dataset. That's the second one here on the bottom left, okay? As long as you connect into the American one, this is gonna work because essentially I need the fact that there are cities in the United States that the name exists in multiple states. You'll see what I mean by that in a little bit, okay? So when we're working with Tableau and you want to know what an attribute function is, or you want to know what any function is, you can actually just look inside of the product itself to find out the meaning. I'm going to go ahead and open the calculation window here, create a calculated field, and you'll notice that mine opens up with this side pane enabled already. Now, if you can't see this, don't worry. There's this tiny little arrow here. This is always frustrating for new users because when they start out with Tableau, it opens this window and you don't necessarily know that there's more to offer when you click this button. But when you click this button, essentially you get this list, and these are all the functions that are available in Tableau. Now, at the very top, they're actually grouped, okay? So you can see all the different groupings for these functions. If I go down to this aggregate grouping, you can see that the attribute one is right at the top. So that's the first clue. The attribute function is a type of aggregation inside of Tableau. What does it do? Well, there's a description right here. So it returns the value of the given expression if it only has a single value for all the rows in the group. Otherwise, it displays an asterisk. Null values are ignored. Okay, so that's essentially what it does. Let's take a look at that. And I'm just going to put this here to the bottom so we can sort of keep it in view whilst we work with it. We're also going to work in the data viz pane whilst that's open. So I'm going to go ahead and go to location. I'm going to open up the hierarchy by clicking this down arrow here. Then I'm going to drag city onto rows, then state onto rows as well. And what we'll get is this table. It's a very simple table that has city on the left, state on the right. Now you will notice that there are some cities here that have multiple states. This makes sense because Arlington is both the name of a city in Texas and in Virginia, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. Auburn exists in 3 states, okay, as a name. So now we've got this set up correctly, we can actually start to see what the attribute function does, okay? What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring this calculation window back into context now. I'm just going to call this ATTR state, okay? And what we're going to do is wrap the state inside of the attribute function. So let's go ahead and just write state. When we do that, Tableau auto-completes when I just click that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to highlight it. This is another hack you can do. When you highlight a field and you double click the function, Tableau automatically puts the function around the thing you've highlighted. So that's a quick way of adding attribute to the whole entire state. Click apply. And now we've got that attribute function here on the bottom left. I'm going to go ahead and drag that next to the state, and you'll see but essentially nothing happens, okay? And this is fundamentally because of the level of detail that we're working with inside of this view. Because we are at the state level of detail, the attribute function is working correctly. If I just go back to the description and we just click on this text here, when you click on these, sometimes they're a little bit buggy, but when you click on the name here in the calculation window, this always works. Now, returns the value of the given expression if it only has a single value for all the rows in the group. So it's working in this sense because everything only has a single value, because the level of detail we're working at is state. So there's a one-to-one match for nearly everything, in this table, in fact, okay? Now, the thing it will do if there's multiple values is return an asterisk. So the way we do that, the way we create this scenario in our view is to just remove state. So I'm going to go ahead and remove state and leave the attribute only. Okay, and you'll notice that now we get the asterisk that it was talking about earlier on. The other thing to note is that it's calling our calculation an aggregate. This AGG notation lets you know that this is an aggregate, okay? So we've somehow managed to create an aggregate function around state names, essentially. So it's somehow sort of creating an aggregation around these things and essentially returning just one value if it's the only value and an asterisk if there's multiple values. And that's essentially what the attribute function does. It's pretty much it in a nutshell. If this is all you take away from the video, then that's all you need to know. Of course, there's a little bit more to this, so we're going to try and dive into that in more detail. Let's try and do that. Okay, so we now know what the attribute function does. Let's talk about when you might use this, okay? Now, if I just bring out a bar chart here, let's bring sales onto columns to build out a bar chart. And what you'll see here is that you get some nice bars here. If I just sort this by biggest to least, you'll see that if I just undo that step, actually, if I just hover over this particular city, Jacksonville, you'll see that the attribute state has a star. And if I go to the one above it, California is in that place. Now, what is quite common is that when you're doing things like blending inside of Tableau, you will often get a scenario where multiple items match to one value. And in the visualization that you're asking Tableau to create, it is not actually possible for it to aggregate that particular value down any more or any less. And so it will just return a star in its place. Okay. So in this case, if I was to take attribute state away from here and put it on the tooltip, you'll see that when I hover over what's this, Columbus, I get a star. If I go to Detroit, I get Michigan. Okay, so this is actually a typical use case for the attribute function. It's essentially telling you, hey, there's more detail underneath this data set. Now, back in the old day, you couldn't really solve this problem easily because it was really difficult to sort of create a way for people to drill in. You probably have to have another chart somewhere else. Now we have charts and tooltips, and you can just create a chart that shows, okay, yeah, this particular one city exists in these 3 different states. And so you can break that view down a little bit more. But in the olden days, you couldn't do that. So this was actually a nice way of letting the user know there's more detail here they need to dig into. So that's one use case for that. Now, for the next use case, this is the one that actually came up in the 2020.4 video, where sometimes when you're working inside of a calculation, you come up against this aggregation error, okay? I'm going to sort of forcibly create a similar scenario just by opening up the calculation window. And we're basically going to create like a pretty pointless calculation, but we should try and make it sort of valid, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to call this sales in city. Okay. And what I'm going to say, if the city is null, yeah. So if is null city, let's just type this in, then null, else sum of sales. Okay. And end. Man, I have written this in some sort of camel case I don't know anything about here. So let's just use the suggestions that it's sort of giving us here. I accidentally clicked else if in that case. Let's just type in else. And you'll see if I just sort of make this larger, you'll see that I'm getting an error here, okay? And if I go down to the bottom here, it says, cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate comparisons or result in if expressions, okay? So what's going on here? Okay, let me sort of say this in plain English. It's basically saying that over here, I'm doing some aggregation. I'm summing everything up. And yet over here, I'm basically just checking a single city. So it's basically saying, hey, you can't simultaneously ask me to add everything up, but then at the beginning of the calculation, ask me to compare it with something that isn't added up. Okay, so it wants me to aggregate the city in this particular case. Now, the way I do that is coincidentally with the aggregate function, okay? And the reason it makes sense here is because when we then bring it into the view, as long as we've got city on rows, this calculation is still going to make sense. So let's go ahead, type in ATTR. So this is the trick I used last time. Essentially, it just helped me clear out this error that I was getting. And now you see the calculation is valid. So if you're trying to write a calculation and you're getting into some aggregation issues and the thing you're trying to aggregate doesn't make sense to aggregate, like a name or dimension or something like that, that doesn't make sense because it's a sort of a grouping or an attribute of a dimension, then this is what you do. You essentially use the attribute function to sort of try and get past that error. And now you can see the calculation is valid. If I just go ahead and use that in my field, I just say apply sales and city, drag that next to that, and you'll see it's exactly the same chart. There is no issue here. But if I was to remove the attribute item there, then it would cause us an issue. So that's pretty much the other use case. So there's 3 use cases really. Like I showed you, telling you there's multiple items inside of a particular grouping or particular level of detail. The second is getting information into tooltips. So when someone hovers over a bar chart or something like that, where there is more detail in there, then they can see that I'll just close this and I'll show you again. This is still sort of the case here. When I hover over Springfield here, I get a star. When I go to Jacksonville, I get a star. When I go to San Diego, I only get California because that's the only item there. And then the other way of doing this is, of course, in a calculation window where you have a little bit of a challenge. So if I go in here, sales in city, you're trying to do an aggregation, it's not letting you. This is what's going on, okay? Now, we're not done yet because there's still more places you can see something called attribute. Okay, what we have here is a very simple view, and I'm going to actually work from here onward. I'm going to remove sales and city from the top row. So we just got sales and city in context. Now, the next thing I want to do is add something into this view. And the thing I want to add is going to be at a higher level of detail than city. Okay, so I'm going to add the country field. Let's go ahead here. Sorry, it's a little bit further up this hierarchy. I'm going to add country onto detail. Now, when I do that, it doesn't change anything meaningful in the visualization, which is a good thing, okay? But watch what happens as I start to expand these items. Let's just add a region. And now you'll notice that Springfield, because it exists in multiple states, can also exist in multiple regions, okay? So you can see here that this region is sort of west, this is south, this is east, and this is central, okay? And so what's actually happening here is this, our region field is controlling the level of detail in our visualization. I know that because it's got this little icon here, which is the same as this one here in the marks pane, which is basically telling you that, hey, this item is actually affecting the lowest level of granularity in the visualization. How do I get around that? Well, this is how. If I want to keep region in the view so that it can be used in a tooltip, but I don't want it to affect the visualization, what I can do is I can essentially turn this into an attribute. So if I go in here, click this drop down, you'll see that one of the items here just after dimension is attribute. And when I do that, notice that it no longer affects my visualization. So this is yet another use case for this particular capability. It's going to do exactly the same thing. So if I go back to Springfield, you'll see that I now get a star for my regions, okay? Essentially what this has done is it stopped region from controlling the way my visualization works. It stopped it from sort of messing up the level of detail. And actually that's a very deliberate trick that you can use. If you just want to bring something into the view, but you don't want it to interfere with your chart, especially if it's the dimension, you can just bring it in. You can do this with virtually anything. So if I go ahead here and get the product name, if I put this on detail, you notice it completely messes up my chart, turn it into an attribute, and boom, my chart goes back to normal. But now the product information is in the view. The problem is here is that there's just so many products, I'm always going to see a star here. So it's really sort of pointless. But if I need the product name in there, this is going to work. Now, if you're really advanced with Tableau, you'll get into use cases where having this information in the marks pane is necessary in order to achieve something else. But that's for another video and that's for another day. So that's pretty much the last use case you'll see for this. Okay. Limitations. This is all we've got left to cover now. There are some limitations with using the attribute function. I've just reset the view here, so we're back to a plain old data source. So I've cleared everything from the sheet and we've pretty much reset the workbook as if we've started from afresh. Now, one of the things I want to show you is to do with dynamic sorting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag sales onto text. Then I'm going to drag subcategory onto rows. This gives us a list of subcategories and essentially the values that go with them. Now, I'm also going to create a calculated field. I'll right click on the field, create calculated field. And what I'll do for this one is I will just set this to an attribute as we did before. So I'll just wrap this in the attribute. This time I'll type it out just to show that I'm not a lazy person. And I'll call this ATTR subcat. Okay, so now we're pretty much ready to go. That's all good. Hit apply. Perfect. It's now gone over here to the bottom left hand side. Now, if I drag that next to the subcategory, you'll see that basically it says the same thing. But when it comes to sorting, it's a slightly different story. If I go to the first one here and I click sort, you'll see that I have the full capability of sorting. I can do all the sorting I want, including any dynamic sorting based on a field. So you can see that the sort changes depending on what I'm actually counting here, the minimum, the maximum, each time this is changing. This is called dynamic sorting. However, if I then go to my second one, let me just clear the sort. When I go over here and I go to sort, you'll see that I can only really sort it by the manual formats. There's no dynamic sorting available to me here because I'm using an attribute function around the dimension. So just a word of caution, you lose this ability when you're using an attribute function. So just be aware of that. If you need to sort with an attribute, you lose a lot of capability. Okay, the next one is slightly easier to show you. Okay, let's just open up a new sheet. And what I want to do here is I want to create a grand total. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag sales and put it onto text again, order date onto rows. Actually, I want to put this on columns, not rows. And then I want to bring the subcategory here again. Okay. And here we have a list of values. Now, the use case here is that if you've used an attribute inside of a calculation, what could happen sometimes is that the grand total won't render correctly. Okay. Let me show you like a forced example. It's not quite the same as sort of a standard example you'd bump along because you would never write a calculation like this, but I'm just going to try and sort of recreate the scenario here. So let's just close this side window because I now know what the attribute function is. And I'm just going to sort of forcedly type something. So I'm going to say if attribute, not the subcategory, if attribute, actually, yeah, we can actually reuse that. If attribute subcategory, let's use that. Let's use the same field we've just brought in. I was going to do something else, but we've already created a function that does that. Equals, and let's say we're checking for something here. Simple string, let's say art. Then sum of sales, okay? And I forgot my brackets, so nothing automatically formatted. Let's just close that off. And capital S for sales. And now we're good to go. Man, I cannot spell. Here we go. Then sum of sales, end. Okay, we don't need to do an else because there's nothing else coming after that. It just assumes that it's null if there's nothing after that. Okay, so if attribute equals art, then sum of sales, end. Okay, so we'll call this attribute sales just to say that it's only going to show if the art attribute is basically the item. So I'm going to hit apply, hit OK. And what we're going to do is we're going to remove this sales value from the view, and we are going to put this on text instead. So far, so good. It's doing exactly as we expected. We're getting the individual values for art and for nothing else. However, if I then go and enable a grand total, a column grand total in this case, you'll see the total doesn't work correctly. And so this is another use case for attribute or limitation, is that grand total sometimes won't render correctly. Now, the fix for this is to use a min or max, but then again, might not render the right values. So just be very careful about how you sort of solve this. This really typically points toward a data prep issue. You'd probably want to solve this problem further back in the stack, as it were, as the data comes in, maybe doing something like order of operations to get around this problem. LODs exist now as well, so you can actually do this sort of more dynamically using that anyway, but just something to be aware of. And then the last thing is to do with performance. I'm just going to build a very simple list. Actually, maybe what I'll do is I will take category and subcategory and put that next to each other. Okay, so we've got a bunch of subcategories that are part of categories. Now, when we use the attribute function in this particular use case, I'm not actually going to write anything. I'm just going to stay on the screen. What the attribute function has to do when it looks at each grouping here, by grouping I'm talking about the categories, is that for each category, it has to go and look at what's inside of the subcategory. So it'll start with bookcases and then realize that bookcases and tables are not the same thing. And so by doing that, what that means is it has to load the entire data set in there. Okay. Now, one of the things is that Tableau is actually very efficient, and it sort of, when you use something like an extract, it pre-indexes the data and it understands a little bit about what's going on. And so if you just need the smallest or the largest value in a particular table, it's actually not a good idea to use attribute if the result would be achieved the same way if you used min or max. Okay, because min or max will be much faster at finding what's first and last than something like an attribute. So it's something to be aware of. Sometimes you're using attribute to solve a problem in the visualization, when in fact you don't actually even need the capability that attribute is offering you. It's just getting past the viz like I showed you earlier. So in those cases, you might be better off using something like min and max to get around the problem rather than using something like attribute. So it's a bit of a weird one to sort of show you. I need to think sort of more creatively in terms of examples examples. Maybe if you've got an example, post it in the comments below and other people can benefit from that. But that's pretty much it for limitations. Those are the three kind of key ones. Those are the ones that Tableau also document on their help pages and that are worth highlighting. So that's pretty much it. That is the attribute function in a nutshell. There's definitely more we could have dived into, but fundamentally, this is all you really need to understand in order to use this day to day. The first one is just using it to tell you if there's more detail underneath the thing you're analyzing. It will show you a star if there is, and it won't if there isn't. It will show you the lowest level item in that particular group. The other use case is inside of a calculation, and the final use case is in this view where you need to change the level of detail without removing information from the marks pane, the rows, columns, or anything else. Okay, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. If you've enjoyed this, you know what to do. If you haven't, let me know in the comments below and I'll catch you in the next video.